My grandparents went to Mexico to get married, and my own parents were only the second couple in our whole extended family to be married legally here in the United States. Anyway, they eventually came down to Los Angeles in about 1895. They stayed in the underwear business for a while, gradually curios, finally antiques. They opened their first store in Pasadena in 1901. They had a store here in 1915. My great-grandfather is the one who got Grace Nicholson interested in Asian art, and he helped her build her house, now the Pacific Asia Museum. My uncles designed the garden of the Pacific Asia Museum. My family has now had a store here continuously since 1980. Can't get my numbers right. Anyway, Fongxi, he was a pretty interesting man. He used to sell tickets to see his stuffed mermaid. He was the first Chinese in America to own an automobile. He had 4 wives, always 2 at a time. He lived to be 100 years old. 12 children. The last was born when he was in his 90s, long before the age of Viagra, so a real accomplishment. And there aren't too many men here today, but this should give you guys something to aspire to, okay? All right, so what I learned as I was working on Gold Mountain, the book that's about my family, is to really think about how we learn history and how we tell stories. We've been hearing about how we tell, these 4 authors tell stories. And we tend to learn history in terms of that front line, right? The soldiers, the generals, the presidents, the prime ministers. But if you take one step back off that front line, who's there? It's women and children and the elderly and families. And they're there every single step of the way. And so I think, and I really believe, that if you can tell the story of one person, one family, you can get to the whole larger history. You can get to the whole, maybe even meaning of what it means to be human and to be part of humanity. Because think about it this way. All of the thousands and thousands and thousands of books that have been written about the Holocaust, what's the one book we all know and remember? Diary of Anne Frank. One girl, one family, and that whole history. So what I've been doing is trying to capture stories and capture these relationships that we have as women. Best friends for life, mothers and daughters, sisters. I certainly wrote about sisters in Shanghai Girls, which takes place, all of it, in Los Angeles, and has to do with this part of Los Angeles that's literally been wiped off the physical map. You all know Olvera Street, right? It was founded by Christine Sterling, a white woman. She wanted to create this authentic Mexican marketplace. You've all been there. You know it's not too authentic, but it's kind of fun. And across the street, she created an authentic Chinese city called China City. And it was surrounded by a miniature Great Wall, and inside it was built from the leftover sets from the filming of The Good Earth. Again, not terribly authentic, but it was a lot of fun. Today, not a single brick left. And so with China Dolls, I wanted to explore that idea of sisters, but also explore this piece of Los Angeles that no longer exists. That the new book that I'm working on, I always start with the relationship. It's a woman gives birth to a baby in China, a little girl, and she is given up for adoption, and she's adopted by a family here in Pasadena. So it's going to be the mother here in Pasadena, the mother in China, and this girl who goes to Westridge. Okay. All right. So I thought I would just say a couple of words about China Dolls. Just really briefly, the plot is 3 young women meet in an audition at the Forbidden City nightclub in San Francisco in 1938. This was the height of the nightclub era across the country, and in San Francisco there were these Chinese American nightclubs where they had performers who were billed as the Chinese Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, the Chinese Frank Sinatra, the Chinese Sophie Tucker, the Chinese Houdini, the Chinese fill in the blank. And sometimes those performers would go out on the road and go to other clubs around the country, and when they did that, they didn't say we're going out on the Borscht Belt or we're going out on the Chitlin circuit. They'd say we're going out on the Chop Suey circuit. So While I was working on this, I wanted to try to find people who might have been at the Forbidden City on opening night, could tell me what the dancers were wearing, what the customers were wearing, what did people eat, what did they drink, what was the club like 3 months later, what was it like 10 years later, what was it like at the very end when, business had completely dried up. So I started finding people. And I interviewed the son of the Chinese Frank Sinatra. I interviewed the daughter of the man who owned the Forbidden City. I interviewed another woman, an actress here in town, Jody Long, whose parents had had a song and dance team. And they all talked to me about what it was like to be at the Forbidden City as little kids. This kind of looking up at everything, and how the little boys used to, get to zip and unzip the chorus girls out of their costumes and things like that. They all told me about one particular little boy who every night would go out and peek out the curtain at the back side, the naked side of the fan dancer. And now every night, his mom would pull him away, and then the next night he'd be there again. But there were 4 women in particular that I wanted to see if I have time to tell you about a couple of them. The first one was Mary Ong Tom. She was very typical of many of the performers. When I interviewed her, she was 93. This was in Tucson, where she was still teaching jazzercise. And her life, again, very typical of many of the performers. Her father died when she was very young. Her mother had bound feet. They had a little tiny grocery store, 20 by 20 square feet. She had 11 brothers and sisters. And she was so poor, the family was so desperately poor, that a family friend in San Francisco sent money and said, "Send Mary out to me, I'll see what I can do." And Mary was so poor when she got to San Francisco that she wouldn't even spend a nickel for bus fare. She walked everywhere. Anyway, she eventually got an audition at the Forbidden City nightclub, where she was hired to be one of the original 5 Chinese-American chorus girls in the country. So she was amazing. I think my favorite of these women was a woman named Mai Tai Singh. Now, Mai Tai, she cut a seriously wide swath. She slept with every man in Hollywood and then some, And actually, at the first book event for this book was at Vroman's. And there was a man who came through the line, and he leaned, to get his book signed, and he leaned in really close, and he said, "I know Mai Tai." Like he knew her, and so then he started listing all the people, all the famous actors she'd slept with, and a 2-year affair with this actor. It was like way more than I could handle. Anyway, she cut a seriously wide swath. She also had one of these very, very difficult childhoods. Her family was desperately, desperately poor, and when she was 5 years old, they left America and moved to Hong Kong. By the time she was 13, she was supporting her entire family with her dancing. At one point, I asked Mai Tai, "So, all the years you were performing, what was your favorite costume?" "So that's easy." Well, she didn't say it like that. So here's the thing. These women are tiny. They were Asian to begin with. They grew up during the Depression. They didn't have enough to eat. They have been dancers their entire lives, so extraordinarily fit. I would say not one of them over maybe 90 pounds. Cute little hairdos and their cute little pantsuits, but when they open their mouths, they sound, I can't even do it, like old Broadway broads, kind of like this. And so I'd asked Mai Tai what was her favorite costume all the years she was dancing. She said, "Oh, Lisa, that's easy. It was a gown made out of 15 yards of monkey fur." Now, that's one of those details that as a writer, it's very hard to use because, real life is stranger than fiction, and that's so politically incorrect today. And then lastly, the person I'd like to tell you about was a woman named Dorothy Toy. Now, Dorothy is considered to be, I just want to say one last thing about Mai Tai. You probably figured it out. The drink was named for her. So here are people that you've never heard of, and yet I bet there isn't a single person in this room who hasn't had at least one Mai Tai. Right? All right, so the last person I wanted to tell you about is a woman named Dorothy Toy. And Dorothy is considered to be the Chinese Ginger Rogers. She's now 97. There were a lot of people who claimed the title, but she really was the Chinese Ginger Rogers. And she happened to be Japanese. And she had, and when asked, when she would say, people would ask her, so why did you change your name? And she said, well, Ethel Zimmerman looked at her name up on the marquee and thought it looked too long, and so she shortened it to be Ethel Merman. But there were other reasons why Japanese, Hawaiian, Filipino performers would change their names to sound Chinese, because these were Chinese-American nightclubs. And where else could they perform? They couldn't perform out on the Borscht Belt. They couldn't perform on the Chitlin Circuit. They certainly couldn't perform in a white club. So if you were, again, Filipino, Japanese, Hawaiian, there was actually one man who was Portuguese who also changed his name to sound Chinese because that gave you a place to work. So she and her partner had this identity for a decade before World War II. And nobody ever questioned it. They were internationally known. They played in London and Berlin and Paris and Hong Kong. They played all over the world, wing and toy. And when World War II came and the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and then we had internment, nobody came to her. She didn't step forward, but no one came to her either because she had so long had this identity, already a decade, as the Chinese Ginger Rogers. And so she and her partner got a big, big break. They came down to Los Angeles. This was going to be, they'd been in other films, but this was going to be the big, big break. And she gets a knock at the dressing room door, and it's the FBI saying, your closest friend just ratted you out. She wants your part in the film, which in fact she did get. And so, because you're Japanese, you've got to go to the camp. But they said, we get it that you're famous. We understand that you're famous. And so we're going to give you a choice. Either we will send you to the internment camp where your family is, or we will send you, or you just need to leave the state. And so she spent the rest of the war traveling around the South with her sister, who was a singer. And they went club to club throughout the South where, what Dorothy said to me, they'd never seen a Chinese, they'd never seen a Japanese, they couldn't tell the difference, we knew we'd be safe. This is my 9th book. I like to think that I've grown as a writer. I hope that I've grown as a writer. I've been trying to follow 3 ideas in my writing, and I know that the other writers have been doing this as well. 2 of them come from the 17th century women writers in the Yangtze Delta, that I wrote about in Peony and Love. There were more women writers in this one area of China in the mid-17th century who were being published than all together in the rest of the world at that time. We'd be pretty hard-pressed to come up with the names of 5 women, but in this one area, over 1,000 women who were being published, who were traveling around the country in the 17th century Chinese version of a book tour. One is, art is the heartbeat of the artist. And these books that I write and these words that I write are my heartbeat, as I know they are for the other writers. The other thing that they believed was that you have to cut to the bone to write. And I really believe that, because what is it that we writers are trying to do? Now, I know this is going to sound pretentious, but just please bear with me. What we're trying to do is get to the heart of human relationships, get to the heart of human emotions, get to the heart of what it means to be human, get to the heart of what it means to be part of humanity. And you can't do that on the surface. And as you've heard from all 4 of us today, and if you've read our books, you know that we're cutting to the bone all the time. And it's not easy. And I think this is appropriate because of Violet, as being a Wallace Stegner Fellow, is a quote from Wallace Stegner that I actually used as the epigraph in On Gold Mountain. And when I used that for my very first book, I didn't know that these were the words that I would continue to follow every day in my writing. And here's what he wrote. Fooling around in the papers, my grandparents, especially my grandmother, left behind. I get glimpses of lives close to mine, related to mine in ways I recognize, but don't completely comprehend. I'd like to live in their clothes a while. And that's what I've been trying to do with my writing, is just live in their clothes a while. Thank you.